start by saying hello, everyone. Whether you're watching this live or not, I welcome you to this interview that we're hosting with our gamer artist in residence, Sharang Biswas. My name is Tristan Goodwin. I am a museum educator, at the Museum of the Moving Image. I've been there for a year and some months now, and I'm also a huge gamer. I love digital games. I love Japanese animation, and that is pretty much the reason why I'm in the museum in the first place. So, well, any further ado, I guess we can finally get started. So my first question for you, Sharang, is why game design? And do you have a preference for digital or
Yeah, so
as
that's
what you
very
call
funny.
analog
Very
games?
funny when you ask an artist, like, why do you practice this kind of art, right? Because there's never really an answer for that that's, I don't know, satisfying for anyone. The artists I know, most of them are like, oh yeah, I started doing this when I was young and I got really into it, right? So I've been playing role-playing games since third grade, not the official kind. The official kind of role-playing games I started when I came to the US, right, for undergraduate, for my undergraduate studies. But I've been playing role-playing games since I was really, really young. And then in undergrad, I took a class with Mary Flanagan, who is, preeminent game designer right now. And then I interned for her and then did a lot of work with Tilt Back to Game Lab, which is her lab at Dartmouth. And I realized, like, oh, yeah. I mean, it was in college when I was older that I realized that, oh, right, there are careers outside of, being a physician or a lawyer or an engineer, which were what everyone's like, you should be one of those things. I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, I was valedictorian in high school, so they're like, oh, you need to now become a neurosurgeon or whatever. And I'm like, and it was in undergrad where I started looking, oh, game design is a thing. Where I started being like, oh, making art is a thing. Someone has to do it. And then I got 2 engineering degrees from Dartmouth, and I realized I didn't want to be an engineer. And then I went to art school where I did I went to Tisch where I did a lot of different kinds of arts, like digital art, game design, interactive theater, graphic design, all kinds of stuff in this program, ITP. And I realized I still like doing game stuff. And I just kept doing it. So yeah.
Wow. So clearly that's like a huge journey, and would you say that your engineering background
I
kind of
mean,
helped
I
in this
I
transition
believe very
between
strongly in
careers?
liberal arts, right? So I have my first degree is a liberal arts engineering degree, right? I literally have a Bachelor of Arts in Engineering Sciences, which a lot of people think like, what the hell's that, right? Um, so people, I'm a strong believer in that to be an artist, any education is helpful, right? Like artists need to draw from all kinds of
Mm.
backgrounds in order to say something interesting. It's not just enough to be technically competent, though that is cool and useful. I think so I would say my engineering background plus my the fact that I went to France and studied there, the fact that I went to Germany and studied there, the fact that I volunteer, all the fact that I grew up in another country and a country that was not the country I was born in, right? So I think all facets of one's education come into play when you're an artist. That said, I strongly believe that part of a liberal arts education is a grounding in the sciences, right, and the scientific method, and a grounding in basic computational ideas. And so algorithmic thinking and mathematics are absolutely useful when you want to be a game designer, especially on certain kinds of games, more so than others, but in general. So yeah, I absolutely think that my engineering background and all my educational sides went into being a game designer.
Huh. No, I can completely relate to that because, I myself study under the computer science background, and then in grad school, I was studying the liberal arts aspect of how video games are art forms and storytelling. So it makes perfect sense to me, and I agree wholeheartedly that all principles or disciplines can be applicable in almost any sense of artist life. And it could also be applicable to science. lifestyle as well. So like there's always like this
And I
balance
think the
that one
Museum of
can
the
grasp
Moving
from
Image as an
any
institution
perspective.
kind of embodies that, right? Because the museum delves both into like the artistic sides of making film, for example, one of the foci, but also the technical side of making film, right? And I think the museum is a really good example of marrying arts and craft and technology and things together, which is cool.
Right. I think like the museum is like this location in which we can look at both technical and like artistic perspectives at any point at any time, and we can
Right. And I mean,
like merge the two if we
the
want to.
idea that an
It's
artist
like a
is just conceptual. I mean, okay, conceptual artists exist, right? But for the most part, artists need to marry both sides of their personality, right? Like if you look at the old masters, they had to make their own paint, for example, right? And then they would like actually paint. Of course, the technical skill of painting is there along with the like artistic, like what visionary idea are you trying to communicate, right? And so that's always been true.
right. So being an artist is a very important job, regardless. So thank you for that answer. It's beautiful. And I think the second question is, when you look at a game as a game designer, like what do you think is the most essential piece or
Well, that's
aspect
obviously that's
to a game?
that answer is going to differ according to who you ask, right? Um, and that so the answer I'm going to give is
Right.
not like this is the correct answer. I mean, I'm a professor of game design, but I'm not going to be like I have the correct answers about how we interpret art, right? What is the most important? I mean, when I make a game, the thing I think about is what verbs are the players engaging in, right? Like, why is this a game and not just a story,
Hmm.
right? I'm also a fiction writer. Why am I making? I've actually literally, I like, for example, I'm part of a new project that I'm kickstarting, that I kickstarted last year. It's coming out to Asia Horizons Fall. It's an anthology of interactive fiction, right? My first draft of my story, I deleted, or not deleted, I cut. I never delete my work, but I cut because I was like, this works better as a fiction piece and not a game. Because I'm like, why? What is the player doing, and how does that inform uh, the message that the game is conveying? And it doesn't have to be a philosophical message; it can just be a story, even. But the verbs that the players engage in, for me, it's important that those marry well with the message. Right? Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the message, right? If I could just do this as a short story, or if
Hmm.
this works better as a movie, or if this works better as a play, then I should do it that way. It works as a game because the verbs the player engages in, the actions the player does or undertake, um, give the game meaning in some way. So for me, that when I make a game, I feel that's really, really important.
Huh. It makes me think that
I
the
mean,
player is the most essential
that's interesting
piece.
question, right?
Because
Last year I released the book Honey and Hot Wax, an anthology of erotic art games, right, with Lucien Khan, and we got 2 grants to make it. And one of the things that Naomi Clark, who wrote the foreword, wrote is that if these games are not, because some of the games in there are very sexually explicit, right? And so Naomi wrote, if these games are not for you, just read them, because even reading them is an interesting intellectual and artistic exercise, right? So in for many of those games, very few people will ever play them. One of the games in the anthology asks 2 players to perform oral sex on each other, right? And of course, like the book talks a lot about like psychological and emotional safety and how to play these games in a way that isn't weird. But still, a lot of players will not want to play that game, understandably, right? Because it's an intimate sort of game. But Naomi writes that, however, it is still interesting to read this and consider what this game offers and what this game does within the artistic and within the game design landscape. So I would say in the argument that the players are the most important breaks down, but I would still say the verbs that a hypothetical player might engage in are still central, right? So.
Hmm. Okay. I think like I had the mindset of like digital games, for example, that like and when you start a digital game, it's
Mm-hmm.
essentially an incomplete piece of art, theoretically. And the player's job is to go through the journey of that game's story to like figure out all the pieces, in certain contexts, in certain genres, for example. But so in my mind, I was thinking maybe the player is like that essential piece in order
Mm-hmm.
for the game to fully
Mm-hmm.
be fleshed out as a
Mm-hmm.
piece of
You know,
art,
that kind
as
of
a piece
that's
of
interesting, right?
narrative.
Because there's a game
And I
recently, I
thinking,
forget what it's called, but it's on Steam. It's meant to be you start the game and then you don't do anything with it, and then 100 days later, the ending of the game happens, right? And there's a whole genre of like idle games, right? Like The Mountain, I think, is a famous one where you start the game, it's like a mountain, and things would happen. You don't really do that much, right? And so, and of course, that brings in the whole debate of what is a game, blah 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 blah, right? But that is an interesting question. Like, does a game need players to be complete? Even in the digital like medium, right? Like, yeah, that's interesting question to consider.
like literally my smart answer to that is like, well, the game needs to be started by the player, and
Right, right.
even
I mean,
to like
that
complete
raises a whole
itself in
question
that
of,
idea.
does the author ish, right? Like, is an art piece ever complete if someone is not like if a tree falls in the wilderness and no one is there, blah blah blah, right? So I feel that verges on that territory, which I think is futile to discuss too much.
I agree wholeheartedly. I was like, we are going to avoid that because I do not like that conversation. um, so I guess this is actually a good transition to the next question. My next question is, what do you notice as a trend in both video and live RPG games in regards to player choice, in regards to the action of a player? Do you think both types of games are very liberating, or do you think one puts
So
more
there's this
urgency
whole
onto that idea of choice
discourse
than the
around
other?
agency, right? Like they're like we always want to give players agency. I was at a conference 2017, I think, where we had a Imagineer from Disney who was also like, all right, agency in our rides, right? And there seems to be this idea that giving the player more freedom and more choice is like giving ultimate freedom and choice is the ultimate expression of a game. Ooh, right? You want the player to be able to do anything they want. Ooh, right? And I feel that breaks down. I don't like this idea of more choice means better game, right? Because part of a game as an artistic experience is that you as the game designer are communicating something to the player, right? And it's the constraints that are imposed on the player that actually say something, right? That actually make it interesting. Personally, I'm not a fan of what are commonly known as open world RPGs because I feel they're very broad. I never feel like I know what I'm doing. I don't feel a unified sense of story. But even more than just the role-playing games, constraints and challenges make a game interesting. If I could do literally anything I wanted, then at some point it becomes less game-like and more just like a simulation of the world. And I'm like, why do I just want another simulation of the world I'm in, right? The fact that in Octodad, Dadliest Cat, you have to use your controls in this bizarre way in order to even move is very interesting. The fact that in what's it called? It's called, I think it's called Consensual Kissing Simulator. No, Realistic Kissing Simulator. The fact that it's so challenging to kiss the other person that you end up poking their eyeball out most of the time with your tongue makes the game interesting. You can't just do anything you want. You are constrained by the controls in this case of the game. Similarly, in role-playing games, like you're saying, I'm a big fan of like the reason I play role-playing games is I get to act within a pre-authored story, right? I really like well-written role-playing game with unusual and interesting plots that an author allows me a certain degree of freedom in. So this trend of we must have more choice, otherwise the game is dumb, I think is misguided. That, of course, that means that, I mean, you have to think about how much choice the player has. What is the intent of offering more choice? What are you doing by allowing players to choose things? But there is a lot to be said about what is sometimes in the tabletop role-playing game world known as railroading, where the player is forced down a certain path. Some of the most interesting aesthetic experiences in games I've had are from heavily railroaded plot. Bluebeard's Bride is a role-playing game based on the folktale of Bluebeard, where it has won like dozens and dozens of awards, rightly so. It's an excellent game that actually deals with some very deep themes of gendered violence and domestic abuse and things like that. It's a horror game. But you know the ending of the game from the start, right? The game master will tell you, you're going to die at the end of this game, or something horrible will happen to you at the end of this game, and now I'm going to play and see how, right? And so having this preordained route can be very powerful. And the idea that choice is the epitome of a game is not entirely accurate or precise.
Hmm. You know, it's like I have very similar feelings regarding open world games because like for me as a gamer, it becomes very frustrating to play because I'm a completionist. So if I want to 100% a game and it takes me 2,000 hours to do so, I'm gonna get
Right.
frustrated and
And
I'm
those kinds
not
of
going to want
games
to play.
irritate
And
me in
like you
some
said,
sense because it's less about what interesting thing is this game doing and more just the fact that you are doing something. Right? It becomes busy work. I'm going to cough. Excuse me. It becomes more about this game exists for you to spend time. And I'm like, I'm not saying that's not a bad thing, right? I think it was Leblanc, I think, who writes about one of the aesthetic ideas of a game could be just game as a pastime. You want something to do, right? But I would say that becomes less of an artistic achievement if your game achieves the state of you get something to do, because there are lots of things to do in the world, right? And that games that are tighter and more constrained and more limited tend to fare better in delivering story and meaning than game where you have a bajillion things to do. In fact, I would argue that many games with really good narrative, I'm thinking, let's say, Dragon Age 3, right? Dragon Age 3 is hailed as a video game with a really interesting narrative. I think are weakened by the fact that you can go around and do a lot of busy work, collect hides of random bears and collect teeth of random werewolves or whatever. And I'm like, why am I doing this? It doesn't further my story very much so. Of course, all this is personal, right? Someone might be like, no, I'm getting a lot. It feels really realistic to be doing all this busy work because medieval fantasy is all about busy, right? Someone else can feel differently, right? But for me, having all dumb tasks to do can be very, very dumb.
right. And I think like another good point is that this agency of player choice wouldn't necessarily apply to like a fighting game genre, for example. Players can't do everything that they want to do or
Right,
else
right. I
it'll
mean,
just be complete
there's like different
chaos.
kinds of
Um,
agency, right? Like, what do you have choice over, right? You can have a like people laugh at if you remember when I forget the name of the company, but when like the Walking Dead games and all those games, which were Telltale, exactly. Thank you. When the Telltale
Telltale?
games came out, people were like, "Oh yeah, these are like interactive movies." Telltale games actually have very little choice, right? Your choices actually affect the plot very very little, like in a very limited fashion, right? But it wasn't the fact that your choices change the direction of the plot. It's that the choices often change the way your character reacted to things, right? And there, it becomes less about guiding the story and more about guiding the growth of the character, right? And so that game, the agency lay in what is your character like? I can imagine perhaps a hypothetical game that's the story that's completely linear, but you get to change the clothes you're wearing every day, right? Or the hair you have every day. And that itself can become an interesting thing. That can become a very political thing, right? Because for a lot of marginalized communities, the clothes they wear and the hairstyle they have can be very interesting, can be very fraught, right? So agency can come in many different flavors, and well thought out games consider where agency happens, what verbs the player engages in, and what choices the players have.
Hmm. I think like the game that came to mind as you were explaining how limited Telltale games completely impact the story and dependent on player choice made me think of like the game series, the Persona series, which is a Japanese role playing game series. And essentially it is like a dating simulator, but like a very serious fantasy RPG at the same time. And based off the relationships that you have with different people based off the choices that you're given, you can befriend all the characters and in return get like more powers in that format. But you're right in the sense that like the story itself doesn't necessarily change. Like as long as you choose like the correct choices that do impact the story, you'll be able
And
to
there's
beat the
nothing
game and see
wrong
like the
with
ending for
graphic
yourself.
fiction that
Um,
allows you to change the plot. That can be very, very fun. It can be very empowering to feel like, oh yeah, I did this thing, and then this other thing happened as a result. Wow, right? Like I'm talking about Dragon Age again. I love that series of video games. Really powerful. Or when you play Dungeons and Dragons with friends, it's really cool to be like, yeah, I can solve this many different ways. I can like seduce the guard, or kill the guard, or debate the guard, or invisibly sneak behind the guard, and do all these things. Right? That can be very powerful, but it's just not the only thing that's important.
right, right. Um, oh, this is fun. I'm enjoying this conversation. Uh, so my next question is, um, since like live RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons encourage the versatility of character setup and allow a huge array of choices depending on the context, do you think there lies a limitation within these games still? Or do you feel like you have to put a
I mean,
limitation when running the game?
excuse me. I mean, if you're playing a tabletop role-playing game, you want to conform to the type of story you want to tell, right? And this actually has brought about a lot of discussion and debate recently, because there are a lot of assumptions that people make about what D&D or what any other role-playing game expects of you, right? Like some people play because many of these games allow for a wide variety of tones and themes, and many of them allow for very specific tone and theme, right? Like I said, Bluebeard's Bride is a horror game about violence against women, right? It was made by three women, and it's a game about violence against women. It is not a game where you're going to play slapstick, right? That doesn't fit the game at all. If you're playing Alice is Missing, another awesome new game, it's a very somber, serious tone about a missing friend, and the game comes with its own soundtrack that really reinforces that. So you're not like, you can't. The game would fall apart if you're like, and this is going to be a game about clowns putting custard down their pants, right? However, some other games like Dungeons and Dragons, or more open games like 13th Age and Shadowrun. So some of those are some of the big name Call of Cthulhu. No, that has a very specific tone. But some of these big games allow for a big tone, right? Playing D&D, for example, you might say, oh, it's medieval fantasy, but you can have very serious medieval fantasy, or very comedic medieval fantasy, or very emotional medieval. You can play a game of D&D where your party is all about finding cute boys to romance and protect against monsters, or you can play a game of D&D where everyone's father is being killed and you need to liberate the marginalized elves, things like that, right? So when you sit down to play an analog tabletop role-playing game, or a live-action role-playing game with well, in which case you're not sitting down, live-action role-playing, you tend to not be sitting down. It is important to discuss with your group what tone you are playing, right? Because if you're playing slapstick, great. Certain things will be okay. If you're playing very serious, it'll be okay. People often think about live action role playing games as being fantasy fighting with a very swashbuckling tone, but like one of my most potent live action role playing game experiences was playing Just a Little Loving, which is a 5-day LARP that you play in the wilderness about gay men dying of AIDS in the 80s in New York, right? That is the game. That is not a game that is slapstick. Obviously, there are moments of levity and comedy, but that is a game that is meant to be somber, that's meant to be discussed. We had daily conversations, and we had experts come and talk to us, and we had survivors come and talk to us, right? So different games suggest different types of worlds, settings, characters, themes, and the games that are more open require, I wouldn't say require, but require you to discuss beforehand what are the expectations for the players, and if there's a game master, then from the game master.
Huh, okay, so it tends to be more of a collaborative agreement
I mean, games
or in
are
many
shared
cases,
experiences.
unless the game
Just
master.
like I might not be in the mood to watch a horror movie, if I come and say, hey, Tristan, we're going to play a game about violence against women, you are well within your rights to be like, I'd rather not play that today. I'm like, great, well, that's what I feel like playing. I'll play with some other. Then you can be like, great, I'm going to go and watch something at some TV, right? So like, yeah, just like any other art form. You may not want to engage in a certain tone and theme at some point, and everyone's allowed that choice, right? I'm not going to be like, no, if you value friendship, you will play this game with me, or I will not be. You know, then you're a horrible person, right? So.
Fair enough. So then I guess perfect transition to the next question. What does the role of being a game master feel like? Does it feel like you have all the power, or is this something that you feel like you
Yeah,
can be a
so that's very
connection for
relevant
like
to
every
the game
player?
series we're doing at the moment, right? Because the game series we're doing is about role-playing games, about this kind of games. We're not doing digital games. We're doing role-playing games digitally. We're not doing digital games, right? And many of them, though not all of them, require this game master figure, right? And in traditional tabletop role-playing games, the game master is a player. So most players take on the role of a singular character, and one player takes on the role of all the other characters, and that's the game master, right? They control every other character that you meet. They control the flow of the plot in certain ways. They control often mysteries. If it's a game which has fighting in it, which many of them do, they control like monsters, and they're also the rules like arbitrator. So if the rules are ambiguous, they're like, oh well, this is what happens, right? What that feel like, again, it differs for each game, and different games are designed for it to feel differently, right? So in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, which we're going to run tomorrow, for those of you watching this live, we're going to run tomorrow, and we're going to run the end of the season as well, if you're interested, so check it out. The DM often does a lot of like planning, the game master, also the dungeon master, also, there are lots of terms for it, right? But the game master often does a lot of pre-planning, designs a lot of like what the players are going to face. Are they going to be monsters? Are there going to be traps? Is there a mystery? In a game like Masks that we're going to run partway through the series, it's a lot more improvisational, right? Where the game master decides a couple of things beforehand, but then reacts much more to what the players are doing, and there are mechanisms in the game to allow the game master to react a lot more. And those games will fall apart if you plan too much. While in Dungeons and Dragons, you want to plan a bit, right? You want to plan ahead a bit. And then in some games, the game master acts really as a facilitator and is just a player like any other. So in a game like Alice is Missing, which I mentioned, the game master is really just the person who knows the rules. They don't control anything. They just know the rules of the game and dispense the rules. In other ways, as a full player, right? So it feels very different. Now, in terms of power, that again becomes what aesthetic do you want the players to get out of it, right? If you want if you're doing a murder mystery, for example, you as the DM want to do a thing where I know the answer and you don't, and you have to try and find the answer, right? That's a very particular aesthetic that is good. But not all DMs, even when playing Game of Dungeons and Dragons, do that, right? And then there's, of course, some games which are murder mystery but are very collaborative, right? In the game Brindlewood Bay that we're running later in the series, the game master does literally and specifically does not know the answer to the mystery. The players come up with the answer, who is the murderer, through the game. It's a really well designed game by Jason Cordova, where the game master knows certain things, but the players literally decide who the murderer is and then orient the clues they found towards pointing to that murderer, right? And so so traditionally when games started first coming out in the 70s and 80s, all of them were about this game master knows everything, controls everything, blah, blah, blah. You only control your limited perception and what the world. But more modern role-playing games of all kinds are allowing players, are changing the power dynamic in terms of authorial control between player and dungeon master. And rightly so, right? Like it is another aesthetic that is interesting. Neither of the two are better than the other. And I say two, of course, the continuum, right? Neither the two extremes.
Okay, so right. So then I guess it would be a better way to think of the game master
In
as
some
someone who
games.
holds the foundation of the
Yeah, in
game
some games.
and just allow the players to build upon
It's a
it.
collaborative thing, right? So, and of course, some players very much enjoy not being in control, right? Loss of control is an aesthetic that's important, right? If we're thinking of like, I don't know, S&M subcultures, right? Loss of control is an important aesthetic, right? But similarly, just like watching a movie, right? You don't have control of the plot, but not having control is what makes it interesting, right? You're like, oh, wow, what's happening next? Ooh, ooh, ooh. I wouldn't want every movie to be interactive, right? When some people say the future of all entertainment media is interactive, everything must be interactive. I'm like, no, that's stupid, right? The future is we have better tools for interactivity, and interactive media can be more powerful and interesting, but I don't want everything to be interactive. That's dumb.
Very fair. Okay. Um, so, okay. So I kind of asked the next question in that conversation, but I do have like a follow-up. So, like, how does this role, of being the game master affect the interactivity between the real-life relationships of the players and the imaginary
I mean,
boundaries of the game? Okay, you already answered that. All right, next question.
Role-playing games that make human connection, right? And I've told a lot of people that, yeah, playing role-playing games during COVID actually has been really cool because I'm engaging with friends in a meaningful way over Zoom. That's not just like, hey, how was your day? Okay, fine, bye, right? Like we're doing activities together, which is very powerful. And so much so that I have friends, and I've done this as well, that use role-playing games to foster bonds between kids or to foster social bonds between autistic kids, for example, right? Games, analog role-playing games in particular, are a shared storytelling medium that allow for social bonds to arise in ways that most activity do not, right? One can compare in some sense to like sports, another kind of game, right? Sports allows certain kinds of social bonds to form that most of the media cannot. Me playing touch football with you is a very different social experience than us going to the cinema and watching a movie together. Is a very different social experience from us creating the history of the elven, I don't know, rebellion against the dragons or something, right? Like those create social bonds in different ways. And so analog role-playing games, well, again, the focus of this series at the MoMI, are a really interesting way of engaging with other people.
Right, and I guess like just for the fact that strangers are coming together to play like this one game with you, to be a part of this imaginary setting can be really intimate in certain ways. It's sort of like
Yeah,
being
and that's
vulnerable
why
without
we
really being vulnerable in a way of like a,
tone we aim to set, and we have like safety techniques like, hey, we're playing a horror game, but like I don't want this kind of, like, I don't want, I don't know, sexual assault in this game, and great, we all agree on that, you know, that kind of thing. because it can be very vulnerable. Mary Flanagan writes in Critical Play. She's not the first one to talk about it, but she says very eloquently where talking about within the magic circle of a game, the stakes of the game can feel very, very real to a player. And anyone who's played like a game of Monopoly with someone who overturns the board because they got frustrated, right, knows that feeling, right? Like the stakes of the game, we all know it's a game, but the stakes of the game can feel very real because we put ourselves into this character and we feel it's called there's a concept called bleed that was made popular by Emily Care Boss, where the emotions of within the game the characters are feeling bleed into real life, right? And because of that, these can be vulnerable spaces, and because of that, we want to take care that, hey, what is our expectation? Do we all know what we're getting into? That kind of thing, right? So
Okay. Beautiful. So it's already 5:35. So I guess we can end it with one more question. And I guess we'll do the last question since we already talking about like the connections that people get from engaging in these sort of mediums. Do you think there's a benefit with engaging these tabletop RPG games that may show up in everyday life? My mindset behind this question was thinking of like how improv, while used for comedy, can show up like in case of an interview, in case of a problem happening in everyday life that makes you think critically and
yeah,
very
yeah. I mean,
fast
I absolutely
time.
agree, right?
So
And
do you,
I also want to take it out of this like capitalist mindset of what are the concrete monetary benefits we get, right? Like, oh, if I'm good at improv, I can do well in an interview, right? The idea that improv acting is all about thinking quickly and on your feet, right? Practicing thinking quickly and on your feet is a useful life skill in all ways, even if it's not like about job interviews, right? And I think that's it. Like
right.
we like humans learn a lot by engaging in fiction, right? There's an indisputable fact. Few people are going to be like fiction is useless, right? Or if you do, then you have a limited worldview, right? So similarly, engaging in these games are an act of engaging with fiction, for one. So there's all the benefits you get from engaging in fiction come from there. It's a social act, and like we just discussed, the social bonds that form while role-playing games are really good. You learn how to be with people. You learn how to be around people, how to escalate and de-escalate different situations. If you want to talk in the industrial revolution capitalist mindset that we want, like, for a lot of kids can learn math, for example. I read essays about like teaching math or teaching economics or teaching history and various subjects through role-playing games. That fits into there are different models of learning, and some of the models of learning are about learning by doing, which is not the only model of learning, but it is a effective model of learning. And sometimes playing role-playing games to learn certain concepts can be really helpful. So yeah, like engaging in any art form can be useful in different ways, right? So games, all kinds of games, I would say, not every single game, but games as a whole, all kinds of games as a whole, can be vehicles to learn new things, to change your perspective about the world, to practice social things. Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty much saying that these sort of games help deepen the relationship that you have with yourself and the world. Um, in very simple layman
It's not.
terms.
Oh, yeah, it's not even just laser, right? Like it's an artistic form, but absolutely, yes. Engaging in role-playing games is a lot about working with people and things like that. So.
Okay, awesome. Do you have any
Yeah,
closing remarks before we
I'm really
end?
excited to be a game artist in residence with MoMI's ed department. It's been really fun. I encourage all our viewers, both live and not live, to check out the series of role-playing games we're running through the museum. They're intended, these are like 2-hour games. They're intended especially for people who are curious about the form of role-playing games or who are curious about some of the specific games involved. Intended for absolute beginners or veterans. If you want to engage in these games as someone who plays a lot of role-playing games, we're showcasing a wide variety of tones of artistic intent. We're having guest designers come and talk about their games. We're also running it over a couple of months, so there's a lot of time. We're trying to be inclusive to various audiences. So, for example, we're doing Family Day of certain games. We're trying to offer discounted tickets if you buy them in advance. We're trying to introduce as wide a group of people as possible to a very wide range of tabletop and live action role-playing games. So I do recommend you check it out, sign up for a ticket or two, and I guarantee you're going to have a fun time and most likely an intellectually stimulating time, which is to be expected from things offered by the Museum of the Moving Image.
For sure. Thank you very much. And for the gameplay series, that link is in our bio, in our profile, so it's easily found. But once again, thank you so much, Sharang, for your time and your energy in this interview. Thank you everyone for watching. It was a pleasure. And with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of their week. Take care, everyone. Okay.